Wandile, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. Well, I mean, certainly from the insert we have just played, it's not the best of times for our farmers. Yet you believe that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. It's not really a time to despair.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the consumer side, it is not a bad time at this point, largely because we still have some other stocks of maize from the previous years and stuff, which could keep prices at least at a relatively lower levels for compared to what, for example, we saw when we had tough droughts of 2015-16. But obviously, one of the other key things that will contribute in here is what is going on in a global global grains market. You have, for example, global grain production up by 2% from levels that were produced last year, and also, if you were to look on that to say what is it that is in there, your maize, your soybeans, it's coming on at large volume. So I do think that when one looks at a global food inflation, prices will be kept in check for a bit. And obviously that will benefit South Africa for some of the commodities that we import. But obviously when you link on to the previous conversation of the insert to say, will this be able to overshadow some of the potential increases that were coming on from the fuel and the other costs, it's debatable. I wouldn't necessarily say it will overshadow all of those increases, but I do think that we are not at a crisis mode. We are still at a reasonable, comfortable levels in terms of the food costs, at least from a consumer side.
Are you saying that will happen in spite of the stories that we have been hearing? We heard one head of a big agricultural organization last week that if you look, I mean, the biggest threat to agriculture in this country is in fact not land expropriation without compensation, but the drought that we are seeing, which is in fact forcing a lot of farmers out of business.
No, I mean, look, the issue of climate change is a serious one, and I think that needs to be addressed at some point. But obviously, we'll address that globally by looking at some of the better practices of agricultural production and also some of the technological improvements that can be put in place. But that's a long-term question. But if you're looking at the near term to say what will actually be happening, particularly for some of the basic food stuff that we have as a country, you take, for example, on maize, we'll still, as South Africa, have at least about 1.1 million tons of maize for export markets, regardless of what is actually happening now. Yes, farmers are under pressure. The crop that we are producing is less than what we produced last year. But if you put everything all together to say how much stocks do we have, and add to that what will coming up from production, South Africa will still sit at a comfortable place in terms of food supplies that we're actually having. But in terms of food price increases, yes, there will be marginal increases, but I don't think that there will be a significant increases from a consumer side in the near term. By near term, for example, if you look 2019 and to say how much are we expecting food price inflation for South Africa to be, we're still sitting on at a comfortable level of about 5% for the year. And we think that while grain prices could be increasing somewhat, but there will be a bit of a deceleration on meat prices, vegetable prices, and that will keep consumers in a best shape, at least in the near term. But obviously, those costs that were highlighted related to climate change because of the poor harvest on the weather side, and also the input costs. Those are some of the things that will continue to put the sector at a tougher position. And the key question is to say, how do we adapt to that? What are the better practices do we have? And South Africa cannot do that alone. That is something that we need to look at globally to say, how do we address the matters around climate change as well as some of the increasing input costs?
Well, from what one expert told us last week, we are also not doing the best that we can do under the circumstances, given the climate change challenges that we are facing. Citing as an example the fact that while there's a great deal of drought in the northern provinces of our country, we're not utilizing better climate and weather conditions that we have in provinces like KZN and parts of the Eastern Cape, for example.
No, I mean, look, I would subscribe to that view, particularly when you look at those former homelands of the Eastern Cape and parts of KZN. Because if you were to take back, for example, 2015-16, when we had a tough drought, if you were to look at the Eastern Cape, conditions weren't as severe as what you saw in the western side of the country. Even in the current year, the farmers in the western parts of Free State and also Northwest, they are in bad shape because of dryness. But if you were to look at the Eastern Cape and the Transkei areas, we have favorable weather conditions in there. Now, the key question should be to say, how do we begin to make the Eastern Cape to utilize some of the other land that is currently underutilized in those areas? And that takes you back to around the land governance question, which is some of the things that are being debated rigorously across the country at this point. And that ties on again with Natal, which you cited. Those are some of the things that we need to be looked at as we look forward. But obviously, in addition to that, the question of agricultural best practices aligned with the climatic smart production side, those are some of the things that I think farmers and those in agriculture should continue doing. And I know that the South African agricultural sector is beginning to be aware of that, is beginning to apply some of the practices already.
Well, I mean, whose job then should it be to play that coordinating and support role so that we don't have to wait things go really bad? There may be good numbers today suggesting that we're not as bad a position across the world as we thought we would be, but whose job should it be to then make sure that work is done now to ensure that we prevent, getting ourselves into a really bad situation in future?
No, I mean, look, that's a job of both the private sector as well as the government. But when it comes to governance of some of those areas that I've mentioned, that's largely more of the government role to play in there. But obviously, they can only play that role effectively if private sector also is at stake, saying, look, these are some of the other challenges, these are some of the interests in terms of production, and then we want to unlock that role. And I mean, I would say, looking on again across the country, that conversation is beginning to happen. If you were to take your look back, for example, from last year, where we were talking about creating extra growth in agriculture and extra jobs, some of the areas that were being cited as the areas that will be of key focus were, again, the Eastern Capes, KZN, and parts of Limpopo. So I would say that the discussion is beginning to happen, but now is about to say, how do we fast-pace that decision and begin to see some fundamental changes on the ground and production expanding in those areas. While doing that, another important discussions to have is to say those that are on the technological development side, seed breeders and everybody in there, what can they do to produce some of the other seeds that could be maybe short breeding varieties and all sorts of things that will be able to cope with the changing climate as well as the changing rainfall patterns, which is one of the other things that we began to see. So this is something that involves both government as well as the private sector having a conversation. But what I'm delighted about today is that that conversation has already begun. It's about it getting steam and continuing going forward.
Mr. Wandile Sihlobo, thanks very much for your time and insights this evening. He is the Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa.